Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. And joining us is the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Good to be with you, Brandon, as always.
Now, as we do at the beginning of each episode, before we dive into the main content, I want to catch up with you. You've had a lot of really cool travels and meetings and stuff over the last couple weeks here. Let's talk about one big event. You went to Lake Placid for a big vocations event. So tell us about that.
I did. It was adventurous, I must say, getting there. Travel is much more difficult now that I'm in L.A. When I was in Chicago, kind of the middle of the country, it was relatively easy. And I signed up for that talk when I was still in Chicago. Anyway, so I left Santa Barbara. It took me about 2 hours to get to LAX. Then the plane was delayed, and then there were bad storms in the middle of the country, so the plane took a very circuitous route. I barely got to my connecting flight, got on the plane, and then that was mechanical problems, and that was delayed 2 more hours. Then I got to Burlington, Vermont, which was as close as I could get by plane to Lake Placid, and a very nice young priest picked me up, and I said, well, it's now about 10:15 p.m. And I said, hope we can get there quickly. And he goes, well, I think we can make it in under 2 hours. I said, 2 hours? And he goes, yeah, depending on whether we catch the ferry. I said, ferry? So, as part of the trip, the car's got to go on a ferry across Lake Champlain. Anyway, to make a long story short, I arrived at the hotel at about 1 o'clock in the morning and then had to get up and give the talk. The talk went very well. It was a great crowd, about 3,000 people from that northern reach of the state of New York, and some Canadians. So you're not far from Quebec and Montreal at that point. So it was great. The trouble, though, is I had to almost immediately get back in the car, go to Lake Champlain, cross over on a ferry, and get back on the plane. So it was a long trip, but it was a good conference. George Weigel was there. Jennifer Fulwiler was there. A number of interesting people and a good enthusiastic crowd. So I enjoyed that.
Now, all that travel time always gives you extra time to read, and we haven't talked about books in a while, so give us an update. What are some good books you're reading? Yeah,
that's true. I the older I get, the less I like traveling, I must say. But it is like a little monastic moment. You're on this plane, and unless the person is, gabbing next to you, you have pretty much time on your own. So it is a good moment to really get focused. I'm reading a lot of different things. I'm reading Brand Petrie's book on Jesus and the Last Supper, which is a more academic version of his more popular book on the same topic. When I was on the road on this recent trip, I got John Irving's latest novel, which came out in 2015, and it's Avenue of Mysteries. And I saw it. I like John Irving, and I saw this title. I thought, I don't even know this book. And I pick it up, and it's about Our Lady of Guadalupe. It's about priests. It's about spirituality in his own kind of, strange, quirky way. So I got that, and I've been reading it. Just finished a biography of Russell Kirk, the political philosopher. What else am I reading? A lot of different things. I tend to read a lot of books at the same time and get bits and pieces.
So let's transition now to the main focus of this show. It's a burning question, I know, for many Catholics, maybe one of the preeminent questions in the church today, and it's, why are young people leaving the church? Bishop, I'm sure this is the same for you as it is for me, but whenever I go out to speak at conferences or visit with other church leaders, this always comes up. No matter what the theme of the event is, I always hear from parents and grandparents who have young people who left the church, and we see this anecdotal evidence confirmed with the statistical data. So the Pew Research Center came out with a new wave of statistics, and it's just as bad as it always has been the last 10, 20, 30 years. The latest round of statistics showed that 50% of millennials, so think like people in their 20s and 30s, who were raised Catholic, no longer call themselves Catholic today. It also found that 78% of people who leave the church leave before age 23. So most of the people who leave early as high schoolers, college age, young adult. What's your initial reaction when you see these sorts of statistics?
Well, they're depressing, and I agree with you. I think the central issue we should be facing in the Catholic Church today, what I've called the massive attrition of our own people, especially young people. To me, it's problem number one. A lot of issues we face. Talk about going to the margins that the Pope talks about. Well, these are the existential margins. These aren't people on the kind of economic margins, but by God, they're on the existential margins. They're drifting further and further away from eternal life. And so I think it's, in the West anyway, in our country, priority number one should be re-inviting, reaching out to these people.
You know, one thing I often hear from parents or grandparents or church leaders is it's well-intentioned, but they encourage family members who have young people who drifted away to sort of just wait it out. You know, that let's just wait and see, and by the time they get married or have kids, they'll probably return. What do you think about that strategy?
No, I'm against it. My generation heard that ad nauseum, and it was a pastoral disaster. It's the same with vocations. My generation got the, hands off, let people make their own decisions. And what happened was a rapid decline in the number of vocations. I know they're all complicated issues, but to me, that strategy, which is very popular in the immediate post-conciliar years, has been a complete non-starter. I think we got to be, I won't use the word aggressive, but I think we got to be very proactive with the young people who are leaving. Because here's what bugs me about it, is the reasons the young people themselves give, and we'll talk about them now in a few minutes, they're all eminently answerable, these objections. It's as though they're trading in commonplaces like, well, of course, everyone knows, now fill in the blank. And my point is, no one should know those things. Those are all dumb things. Those are all intellectually irresponsible positions. And the church ought to be in the front lines of defending itself and proactively going after people. You don't think the new atheists are proactive in the way they target young people? Give me a break. The church ought to be in the fight. You know, that great passage from the book of Exodus about Moses and the Israelites battling the Amalekites. And Moses sends certain picked men into battle. Well, the church would be doing the same thing. Moses would be the pope and the bishops. He's up on a hillside overlooking, the battle. And he sends certain people into the battle directly. Good. So should we. I'd like every bishop in this country to have picked people they know are really good at apologetics and really good at evangelization, smart as whips, and send them out into battle. Is it a battle? Yes. Reread the passage. Israel battles all the time. And if I can just stay with that for a second, mind you that as long as Moses keeps his arms up in prayer, the battle goes well. And when the arms fall, that's when things go bad. Well, everybody in the church, everybody, young, old, in between, can pray. Pray that our young people come back. Pray that in this battle we get the upper hand. Anyway, I'm getting worked up here, but I feel very strongly about this.
Now, the Pew Study, along with a handful of other data compilations from groups like CARA, from groups like the Barron Group, one interesting thing they've all done is they not only collect statistical models, but they also attract actual responses from real people who have left the church, and they're pulling these together and finding common themes, common patterns. And so I'd like to look at a handful of these reasons and maybe get your rapid fire responses to each of them. So again, these are verbatim reasons that young people give as to why they've left the church. So let's start off with this first one. Religion is the opiate of the people.
Yeah, of course, that's from Karl Marx. And if young people know that phrase, they've learned it from their Marxist professors, I'm unhappy to say. It was as stupid in the 19th century as it is today. So, I mean, here's one way to do it, the opiate of the people thing, is to pull what the logicians call a tu quoque, which is meaning you too. Give me a break, as though this sort of patronizing, condescending thing works only in regard to religion. Oh, you poor religious people, that you accept these crazy old myths and fantasies so that you feel better about yourself and you drug yourself against the struggles of the world. See, here's my tu quoque. An atheist, a non-believer, an agnostic, that is just as psychologically fulfilling if you want. You tell me, hey, there's no objective ground for morality. There's no God in heaven. I can live my life any way I want. I'm the complete commander of my life. You don't think that's psychologically pleasing? You don't think that's a kind of opium? So why don't we just call it a draw? That sure, both sides could be accused of playing a psychological self-fulfillment game. Fine, it cancels out. Now, let's get serious. End this silly childish stuff, and let's get down to argumentation. Does God exist or not? Let's talk about that. You know, we can play all day this psychodynamic game of why are you holding what you hold? Who cares at the end of the day? That's the genetic fallacy, too, to use another logical term. uncovering the source of a belief is tantamount to determining the truth of a belief. That's the genetic fallacy. So I got zero sympathy for opium of the masses.
You know, this objection calls to mind for me the great convert C.S. Lewis, who, in Surprised by Joy, when he's describing his conversion, calls himself the most reluctant convert in all of England. It did not bring him great joy or comfort or pleasure to know that God exists, but like Socrates, he wanted to follow the evidence wherever it led.
Yes.
And I think that's the approach we need to take.
No, quite right. And see, behind Marx, of course, is Feuerbach, the founder, the father of all modern atheism. Feuerbach, who said, religion is a wish-fulfilling fantasy. That was echoed by Marx, echoed later by Freud. Now read every new atheist under the sun. They all echo it. It's as stupid today as it was then. So let's forget the genetic fallacy. Let's the tu quoque. Let's get back to real argumentation. And you're right about Lewis. Hey, I might not like it immediately, but I got to admit, God exists. Now, I'm going to say once you accept that, you're going to find tremendous joy and tremendous psychological fulfillment in that truth. But what matters finally is the truth of it.
Let's turn to the next reason that young people often give. This one, I guess, is a collection of many different related reasons, but here's how the Pew Study Center put it. There's a lack of any sort of scientific or specific evidence of a creator. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I'll tell you real quickly, this fall, I'm speaking to all the high school teachers of the LA Archdiocese. There's a lot of people. I'm in 5 different regions. Each audience is about 300 or 400 people. Well, in the wake of this survey, what I've been doing is my first move, and I say, could all the science teachers please stand? And they do. Then I say, now, could all the religion teachers please stand? And they do. And I say, okay, you two groups need to talk to each other. We are not talking to each other. And this is a major reason that young people give, that somehow science has disproven religion or science is at odds with religion. Hoy, where do you start? I'll say this quick thing. In a very real sense, the sciences cannot adjudicate the question of God because God is not an item within the universe. God is not a thing discoverable through empirical analysis or deductive reasoning based upon empirical analysis. That's not where we discover God. God is not an item in the world. Rather, God is the reason why there's something rather than nothing. God is the reason why there's a nexus of contingent causes at all. The sciences study the nexus of contingent causality. Terrific. Off you go. We're totally in favor of that. But it's a scientism that would say, if the sciences can't adjudicate it, it's not even a real question. It is philosophy and religion, and this is a topic for another day, but philosophy and religion that address the question of why is there something rather than nothing. My point here is the sciences cannot even in principle determine this issue. So please, young Catholics and young believers, don't believe the lie that the sciences somehow have ruled out the existence of God. They have not, because they cannot. Can we find rationally compelling warrants for belief in God? Yes, but they happen to be non-scientific. You know what I'm saying? We're not going to determine this thing on scientific grounds, but we can find rational warrants. Now, revisit all the famous arguments for God's existence. So anyway, that's my quick response. Evidence. I'd like to rule that word out, and here's why. It applies properly within the context of the sciences. I'm looking for evidence, meaning physical traces upon which I can draw certain conclusions and so on. Okay, I can experiment, etc. Fine. But you're not going to find, everybody, physical traces of God, as though God's like a dinosaur and we're going to find traces of him, or God's like a meteorite. Is there evidence that it passed this way? You don't find evidence that way. You find rational warrants within the ontological structure of finitude. I'm using high philosophical language there, but you can find rational warrants, but don't reduce everything to the sciences. That's a non-starter.
Sometimes when I'm talking to scientifically minded skeptics, I like to gently push back when they suggest that science has somehow disproved God by asking which scientist, what experiment, what specifically you're referring to, and inevitably they're at a loss for words. And so what I found is there's sort of this atmosphere that's invading most of our schools and universities and culture that just vaguely suggests that science has somehow disproven God, but there's no specific reason how it's done that. Have you encountered that too?
No, and you're dead right. And the reason is it doesn't exist because it can't exist. That if you think you found that, it's precisely not God that you found. I mean, it doesn't exist because it can't exist.
So let's look at the next reason. You see this one, I know you've told me a lot on YouTube, but the reason that this group of young people gives is that more harm has been done in the name of religion than any other area. So religion is so violent that it can't possibly be right. What do you say to this? It's demonstrably false. And it's grounded in a prejudice that was born at the beginning of the modern period, the beginning of the Enlightenment. And it was part of the mythology, the birth narrative, if you want, of enlightened modernity, that reason emerges out of this long twilight struggle against religion. Keep in mind the wars of religion that were indeed devastating Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Many of the intellectuals of the time, think of from Descartes to Kant to Leibniz to Spinoza, were reacting against that. So I get it. I mean, I get it. They were reacting against what they took to be religious violence. But it is demonstrably false, and a number of studies in recent years have proven it. It's demonstrably false that religion is uniquely or primarily responsible for violence. In fact, if you look at all the wars fought in human history, a remarkably small percentage can be ascribed to religion. Just look, everybody, at the last 100 years, 120 years. The number of people who've been killed in the name of secular modernity and of the modern nation state far exceeds, by an order of magnitude exceeds, anyone that was killed in the name of religion. And so that's a myth propagated by the advocates of enlightened modernity, but it's demonstrably false that religion is the source of most of the world's violence. And again, as you did with the first objection, sometimes it's helpful too to say, well, even if that's right, even if that objection's true, that religion is violent and responsible for all of these wars, that's independent of the question of whether it's true.
Sure. Whether it's true, yeah. No, that's right. That's right. It's another version of that genetic fallacy, that, let's say for sake of argument that people have in fact been fighting about religion from time immemorial. And let's say for sake of argument, it's caused most of the wars in human history. It has not, mind you. But even if it were true, well, it still leaves the question, is there a God? I mean, does God really exist? Have human beings manipulated and abused religion? Well, sure. And they still do to this day, as we all know. But it doesn't, as you say, touch the issue of objective truth.
Now, this next objection's a big one. It's probably going to be a perennial challenge for the next 100 years at least. But how do you respond to somebody who says the clergy sex abuse scandal is why I could never be part of the church?
Well, first of all, I would say I get it. I mean, I get it. It's been the worst crisis in the history of the American church. One of the, 3 or 4 greatest crises in the entire history of the church, I would say. So I get it. My whole priesthood practically has been under the cloud of the sex abuse scandal. It, as I've said a million times, it's hurt the work of the church in every way. Think of from teaching to preaching to evangelization to recruitment for the priesthood. It's hurt the church in every way. It's the perfect storm. It's reaffirmed my belief in the personal devil, because I can't imagine a more intelligently conceived attack on the church than the clerical sex abuse scandal. So let me say all that right up front. I get it. I've lived with it over the past, 25 years as a priest. I've lived with it in the front lines as a seminary person, teacher, then rector, So I get it. I truly do. But I'll add this, though, right away. Go right back to St. Paul. First century, the first generation of the church. And Paul says, we hold a treasure in earthen vessels. He knew that the treasure, which means revelation, it means the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, it means Christ, it means the message of salvation. That's the treasure. We hold it in very fragile, flawed vessels. Paul knew it. It's been true up and down the centuries, true to the present day. And so should you make the move of separating, to a degree, the treasure from the vessel? And I'd say yes. I'd say yes. Is Christ born to people today by a very fragile vessel of the church and its priests and bishops? Yeah. But the treasure and the vessel are not simply identical, So I'd make that distinction. The very thing that allows you to see how bad the clerical sex abuse scandal is something that the church has brought to you. Does that make sense? Your very moral vision, your moral indignation, your sense of, man, this is out of step with what Christ wants. Yeah, that was brought to you by the church. So it's that subtle game we have to play. I think even as I totally get people's frustration, I totally get it. It's too facile to say, ipso facto, I'm leaving the church. Ipso facto, there is no treasure. The treasure and the vessel are not simply identical.
Here's the next objection that young people give as to why they leave the church. I don't have a particular religion because I'm open-minded, and I don't think there is one particular religion that is right or wrong. What do you make of that?
I'd say that's fine as long as you're talking about something that you don't care about. But I would challenge someone that says that. If you care about something, you don't use language like that. So I know a lot of young people in their teens, 20s. Man, are they passionate about politics? And they're like, let's say, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, man, he's right. Democratic Party, they are right. I don't hear them very often saying things like, I don't really take a stand on that because there's no, objective thing. It's just, whatever you prefer. If you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're a Sanders guy, you're a Hillary Clinton person. I don't hear that talk at all. I hear talk of very strong advocacy for positions that they see are objectively right. Now, argue about it, sure. But I don't hear them opting for this kind of, wishy-washy, easygoing subjectivism. When you care about something, you don't play a subjectivist game. I challenge anyone there. You care about something, whether it's a sports team, it's a political party, it's a moral position. You care about it. You don't play the subjective game. You get very objective. So religion, I'm with John Henry Newman here, is not just a question of my subjective sentiments. Religion makes objective claims about God, about Jesus, about the world, about creation, about sin, about salvation, about resurrection. All right. Argue if you want. Say it's crazy if you want. But don't patronize me by saying, oh, well, that's a nice little position you hold subjectively, and I got my little position. No, if you care about these things and you know what claim is being made, well, you know how objective it is. So I guess I would challenge you. I would just say I don't think you accept this logic in any area of life that you take seriously.
There's obviously a latent subjectivism or relativism, call it what you want, behind that objection. But there's also this phrase open-minded, which for many people in my generation has been lifted up to a virtue that we don't, I'll let whatever psychologist or sociologist determine the roots of this, but it's a reality that young people are hesitant to sort of settle in, not just in a home or in a school or in a city, but ideologically. They don't want to close their minds around something. What do you make of this open-mindedness as a virtue?
Yeah, well, I distinguish between ends and means. I mean, an open mind can be a good means at a certain stage of a conversation. So Thomas Aquinas' Summa represents, if you want, a very open mind when it comes to searching out a question. Here's what's being claimed, here's a counterclaim, here's arguments to that. And you keep your mind open in the process of sifting through. But then, as Chesterton said, an open mind is like an open mouth. It's meant to close down on something nourishing. The trouble is your mind can be so open, as they say, that all your brains fall out. My mind is so open that it never seizes on something that's really nourishing. And see, again, when it comes to something you take seriously, people don't use this language of open-mindedness. Let's say someone today was arguing vociferously for a Nazi policy. And they said Hitler was right. I mean, I agree with Hitler. And I think people should read Mein Kampf. And I think this National Socialist position is a legitimate one. Do you have an open mind about that? Should they be invited around the table conversation? Someone says, hey, I advocate sex between adults and minors. I think that's fine. And, it's a free country and I'm not hurting anybody. And I think you should have an open mind about that. Do you? Do you on those matters have an open mind? You just say, oh, sure, whatever you want. Every voice should be represented. Do you think that voice should be represented around the table? I don't. So when it comes to something serious that we take seriously, we drop this rhetoric of open mind. What I want you to do, I'd say to people, is take religion seriously. It's not just a hobby like, hey, I like cards, you like surfing or something. It's a hobby. No, it's making truth claims. I take it seriously. I want you to take it seriously. So let's have an argument. See, these little moves are ways of obviating real argument. You see what I mean? Oh, no, point of view, and you and me, and open mind, and who am I to judge? Well, all that's a way of just avoiding argument. I want people to return to the table of argument in regard to religion.
And just to clarify here, when you're encouraging people to return to argument, you're not necessarily suggesting they have to be argumentative. Talk about the distinction between these two words.
An argument is making a rational case, right? So it means you're going to marshal evidence, you're going to assess evidence, you're going to draw a conclusion, and you're going to state a position. So you argue. Argumentative, you might say, is this aggressive, maybe hate-filled rhetoric. You're argumentative. I don't mean that. I mean Thomas Aquinas, who makes an argument. I mean John Henry Newman. I mean Chesterton. I mean John Paul II. People that make arguments in the public forum. There I've always agreed with Stanley Hauerwas, who said that religious people have largely forgot how to make an argument about religion. That our two options are, uncontested advocacy or violence. Well, there's a middle ground, which is argument. And I would encourage young people, get in the forum. Let's make a case, and don't opt for this easygoing, who cares-ism.
Let's look at one final objection. And as I read it, I know that if there are any parents of teenagers listening to this show, they're going to be nodding their heads in agreement because they've heard this one over and over. So here's the objection. I don't have time to go to church, and when I do go, it's so boring. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, again, transpose the conversation into an area of life that you take seriously. So you're a young person, and you are a gifted skater. Let's say early on you showed ability in this area. Skaters, I know some of them. When they wake up in the morning, probably like 4:30, and they get to the rink at 5:30, and they go through, workouts and drills. Exciting every minute? I doubt it. I'm not a skater. I doubt it. I was a basketball player when I was a kid. Football, 2-a-day workouts in the hot sun in the summertime, getting ready for the football season, going through drills. So not the fun of actually playing the game, but just going through drills, Exciting every minute? Not in my experience. I was a basketball player until I was in high school. And I love basketball, love playing the game. But, man, the drills, hours and hours of practice. I remember doing wind sprints. We call them, I don't really call them today, but we call them wind sprints when you'd go to a certain part of the floor in the back, and then to the midcourt in the back, and then to 3/4 in the back. And, you're like dying from this. Well, why was I doing it? Because it was a thrill every minute? No, because I was practicing these sports. I recognized the playing of that game as an excellence that I wanted to cultivate. And so I accepted a lot of, not the most exciting, sometimes very challenging, difficult stuff. That's one angle on it, one angle. We talk about practicing our faith, right? Well, is every moment of Mass going to be spiritually thrilling to you? It's not to me, not every moment. But do I do it? Yeah, every day. I practice my faith. Why? Because communion with Christ I recognize as the supreme excellence in my life. Am I willing to, get up early sometimes, travel inconveniently, maybe put up with, let's say, a hyper lengthy liturgy if I'm not quite in the mood for it? Yeah, as I do in any other area of life where I recognize an excellence that I want to participate in. Now, that's one angle. We could say much more about that, because the more positive side is it's boring precisely in the measure that you bring nothing to it. If you know what the Mass is, you understand what the Mass is. There's nothing more dramatic, nothing more thrilling, nothing more fulfilling and fascinating bottomlessly compelling than the Mass. So that's the positive side. But I'll just stay with that, if you want the negative side, that you're willing to put up with difficult practice because you recognize an excellence that you want to cultivate.
I once heard Scott Hahn give a good analogy. He said if you took a young person to an orchestra and they had no idea what was going on, they couldn't distinguish between the winds and the brass, they didn't understand musical themes, they would be bored out of their mind. But once they learned all that, the music would open up in dramatic new ways. Isn't the Mass like that? Yeah,
that's right. And the same with sports. As you learn these moves, then you're able to play in a way that is thrilling and is wonderful. You're a basketball player. You know what I'm talking about. But you got to go through something. You got to pay a little bit of a price. Why do we accept this in every other area of life, but somehow we don't accept it in regard to religion? I don't get that.
Let me ask one final question. We've responded to a lot of these objections, but suppose you were sitting right in front of a group of young people who have all left the church, and instead of responding to the objections, what positive thing would you say to them to explain why they should return to the church? What reason would they have for reconsidering the Catholic Church?
I think maybe it's got a negative overtone as well, but I would talk about the Augustinian truth, that you've tried a lot of things to make you happy, and they don't, do they? Because when people are old enough, you're beyond 8, 9, 10, now you're 17, 18, you get it by that point. You've tried a lot of different things to make you happy, and they haven't, have they? They haven't fulfilled you. That's a very important moment. Why do you come back to church? Because the church is proposing the one thing that can fulfill you, which is the love of God. And I'm going to challenge you, I'd say to young people, try this. Because the other avenues you've tried, if you're really honest with yourself, you're really, not in front of your friends trying to be cool, you're really honest with yourself, they don't satisfy you. I got the one thing that will. And so I'm going to challenge you to come back and try it.
Well, it's time now for our regular question from one of our listeners. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, just visit askbishopbarron.com, where you can record your question on any phone, tablet, or device. And every episode, we pick one question to air here on the air. Today, we have a great question from Gustavo, which is related to a lot of the things we've been talking about today. He has an atheist friend, and he's wondering what resources Bishop Barron would recommend for dialoguing with him. So here's Gustavo's question.
Bishop Barron, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. What I would like to ask you are two questions. First one, which author would you recommend to an atheist who is an atheist from the rational side? And which author would you recommend to an atheist who is atheist more from the emotional side? Thank you very much.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that question. I think you're right. There is a distinction between the kind of objections people have. The rational side, anything by William Lane Craig, the great apologist, evangelist, who's super smart and knows how to use the philosophical tradition, I think, in a very provocative way. If you want to get serious about it, then Thomas Aquinas and people like that who will give you a very rational sort of approach. On the emotional side, I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I think Mere Christianity is good really for anyone that's wrestling with religion issues. His book Surprised by Joy, which is it's kind of a spiritual autobiography for someone who's maybe not getting at it so much from the rational side, but who's wrestling with the possibility of religion. That's a very fine book. Anything by Chesterton, certainly Orthodoxy, The Everlasting Man. A book I like a lot is Peter Hitchens' book. I'm blanking on the title now, but this is the brother of
Rage Against God.
Is that it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But he's the brother of the notorious atheist Christopher Hitchens. But his brother was an atheist and then kind of thought his way back to a very vibrant Christian faith. Get his story is, I think for someone with an intellectual side, but even beyond that, would find it really compelling. There's a couple thoughts off the top of my head.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. I want to ask you to do one thing for us that would really help. If you could visit the show on iTunes, so if you just go to iTunes and search Word on Fire show, or visit our website, wordonfireshow.com, we have a link directly to the iTunes page, and leave a review of the show. Every time you leave a review, it gives the show more clout and causes iTunes to expose it to more people, and so that helps get the show out to a much wider audience. So please leave a brief review of the show on iTunes. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.